Leadership shows up in many different ways. One of the ways that this shows up is based on our skills or our experience. But leadership can also show up through a totally different set of criteria that are unrelated to skill set or experience. And that is something known as ascription. For example, if you are the King of England, then your leadership is given to you based on the traditions of the English monarchy. That's not to say that the King of England or Queen Elizabeth were not equipped or capable to leading the way that they did, but they were nonetheless the king and the queen based on traditions, and it has nothing to do with their experience. Conversely, if you work in most corporate settings today, people will hire you and you will be promoted and move on to different positions based on your skill set and your experience, not so much based on your family name or things like that. But we'll dive into that here in just a moment. One of the issues is, however, that people in corporate settings tend to lead a little bit the way King Charles would lead. In other words, it's the idea that people tend to lead based on who they are and their title rather than the things they've accomplished and their skills. So we're going to dive into that today, all right? We're going to go back to our board, and those are two concepts or two ideas referred to as ascription and achievement. These are, by the way, other cultural norms also explored in my book, but these happen, remember, they happen subconsciously. So as we've talked about in other videos and discussed in other aspects of cultural norms, these things, these norms are not self-evident. They happen subconsciously. They happen hidden away from our consciousness, from our logic and our thinking mind. And that is because they were born out of a culture. Now, more often than not, this is the culture that has to do with our own upbringing, the culture of our community, our workplace, or even our country. But ultimately, we can learn these things. We can learn about these cultural influences. We can learn about how we tend to lean, and then we can obviously adjust and course correct when needed. As with all the cultural norms that we talk about in these dimensions, there's not a right or wrong. It's not that one is better than the other. It's about effective and ineffective. In other words, there is a time and a place for ascription, and there is a time and a place for achievement. That being said, in today's professional workplace, leading via achievement is probably going to net better results overall than defaulting to leading by ascription. So we're going to unpack both of these ideas here in just a moment. Let's start with ascription. So remember, sometimes these words are a little confusing and I even forget them. So I like to use imagery, like an icon or something, to help me remember the concepts behind. So when you think about ascription and everything that has to do with ascription, I want you to think of a king or a queen. Ultimately, think of somebody that kind of wields power as a result of who they are, right? The King of England or the Queen of England, just to use an example. Now, people who operate based off of ascription, their status is based on who they are or who you are. For example, if you tend to lead most of your discussions by saying, I am so-and-so and I am the vice president of X, Y, or Z, or I am the CEO, or I am the account director, or I am the owner, or I am, which, like I've mentioned before, there's nothing wrong with any of that. Nothing at all. You're just leading from a place of ascription. So your status and your position is based on who you are. And that is something that you can find on a business card, or it can be your Instagram and your social media followers. For instance, you might say, I'm an influencer. Why? Well, because I have 1 million followers. Okay, so apparently that would qualify as making you an influencer. Now that influencer may or may not have a certain set of skills and experience and useful information. That's, so to speak, to be judged as to whether that is any useful information or not. And by the way, I'm not hating on influencers, but I'm just trying to draw the point because I think when we think about a king or a queen, it feels so far removed that it pays to just kind of bring that or reel that back in. So you might say, hey, I'm the owner of a corporation. I'm the owner of a company. Whatever. So you get my point, right? When you mention the way that you are perceived by others via your title, your position, then you're leading from ascription. That's not a bad thing, remember. So there are many merits that come with that. For example, well, merit's probably not the right word. There are many qualities that come to that. For example, if you present yourself as the vice president of an organization, that has a connotation of leadership and necessarily skill and achievement, because to become the vice president of an organization, you require to have accomplished a certain number of things, right? So it just goes without saying. However, if your goal is to relate to the people that you lead and to relate to other people, then if you lead with those ideas around your title, your the university that you attended, or anything to that effect, then you're not going to become very relatable or very memorable from that perspective. You will achieve compliance. So we'll get to this in just a moment. There are other traits that have to do with ascription. For instance, it's very simple to think about the idea of a supervisor and a subordinate. So your supervisor has an immediate sway over your overall performance and your achievements because of who they are. They are your supervisor, right? So they hold a certain ascription quality over you. And that's normal, natural, and even expected. However, think about a boss or a supervisor that you just didn't care for. And maybe it was because their style just didn't fit with you, or maybe it was they just didn't really care about you, or maybe their leadership style just didn't fit with your values. But I would be willing to bet that more often than not, there was some component of ascription hidden between the lines. Meaning, that supervisor of yours would have led through many instances of do this because I said so. Even if they didn't explicitly use those words, their behavior, their actions, and everything to their personality was tied to the idea that I'm going to tell you what to do, and I want you to do that because I said so, right? So this tends to be very ascriptive. And by the way, this works very well in certain settings. For example, TSA personnel. Now, I discussed the idea of TSA personnel in my book, but if you're going through airport security, more often than not, you're going to go through TSA, right? It's just the way of the world today. Now, TSA, they're wonderful people that are doing a job, a very important job for that matter, but their main goal is compliance. Like if you were to sit in a meeting with TSA agents, and I've had some discussions with former TSA agents that have become police officers, and which is not surprising because it's a culture of law enforcement, right, of compliance. The discussions revolve around getting somebody to do something that you want them to do. That's really what it comes down to. When passengers are going through the security line before they board a flight, the security personnel needs to make sure that they're not carrying any weapons or drugs or anything that could cause harm to themselves, other passengers, or the flight itself, right? This all makes perfect sense. Well, in order to do that, there's a certain series of actions that they need to take. So that's why you go through an x-ray. That's why your luggage goes through an x-ray machine. That's why you get patted down every now and then. That's why they're very directive in the way that they give instructions. They'll say, take your belt off, leave your shoes on, take your laptop out, leave your laptop in, whatever that might be. And they're also looking for inconsistencies in behavior that can prompt potentially some hazard or risk that they're going to want to look into a little bit further. Ultimately, though, the idea behind TSA personnel is that they're leading from ascription. Those individuals have been assigned that power based on who they are. In other words, they are a TSA agent. So whether they're brand new on the job or whether they've been doing it for 10 years, the quality of a TSA agent and their objectives is going to be the exact same, which is compliance for you as a passenger. So ultimately, another way to view it is they are the king, right? They're the queen. If you tell a TSA agent, no, I'm not going to take my belt off. I love my belt and I don't have anything in my belt and I would like to go through the security line without taking my belt. I guarantee you that they will ask you to remove your belt or you will not be able to board that flight. They're looking for compliance. So in that instance, leading with ascription is a good thing because we want to make sure that people who board that flight are not going to harm everybody else, right? So it makes perfect sense to lead with this. TSA is just a super easy example because it's so obvious. But there are other instances where you can lead with ascription and it would be the appropriate way to lead. However, I would say that in most professional settings, you probably would be better off leading this way, achievement. So we're going to move over to this side of the board and talk a little bit about that. All right. So in achievement, you earn status based on what you have done, what you've achieved, your knowledge, and your skills. So whether you're the king or the queen really doesn't matter. And this is, by the way, why some, ironically, kings and queens have been criticized over the years based on what they achieved and what they accomplished. And then other kings and queens have been kind of raised to a whole level of consciousness based on their own achievements. In my book, I specifically lean on the experience of somebody called Ernest Shackleton, who was an English explorer who sailed to the South Pole and was the first individual who attempted to cross the South Pole on foot. And this was in the early 1900s. A great story, by the way. It's based off of a book called Endurance by Alfred Lansing, which is to this day, I think, my absolute favorite book. I read it and I also heard it on audiobook and it was amazing. So anyway, just something to think about if you're looking for a summer book to read. Well, when it comes to achievement, remember, this is more about what you've done, what you've accomplished. So a good icon to think about is a medal. So just like imagine yourself wearing, like a first place medal around your neck. Not because you're better than anybody, but because you accomplished it. Think of maybe like a marathon. If you complete a marathon, at the end of the race, you get a banana and you get a medal. So it's like, hey, good job. Or the little star on your forehead is when you were a kid. So this is the way to think about achievement, is you accomplished something and in the process of accomplishing that, you gained status. So when we think about people who have run marathons or that have completed an Ironman or people who are, doing like CrossFit competitions and we look up to them, not because of their name or the school they attended, but rather because they accomplished a feat that was very difficult. When you're in the workplace or in your professional careers, you will encounter leaders who use this system, who just naturally default to achievement. Also, achievement is very common in the US. So in other words, it's probably more likely that you're going to run into an achievement type culture if you work in the US than an ascription type culture. But there are still like pockets of ascription everywhere, not just in the, across the country, but everywhere around the world. So it is important to notice this because also people who lead from ascription, I'm kind of going back here a little bit. However, people who lead from ascription want their ascription to be acknowledged. That's why the king is just such a good example. When you think about a king, I've never been in front of a king, but I believe there's a protocol in how you address the king and what you should and shouldn't do and things like that. So why is that? Because they want their presence to be acknowledged. They want their ascription to be acknowledged. It's actually not that different from like celebrities or other people. I remember watching I love Formula One, and I was watching, I think it was a race in Monaco just a couple weeks ago. And Lewis Hamilton, who is a really famous Formula One driver, he drives for Ferrari right now, but he won all his championships with Mercedes-Benz. Anyway, apparently him and Kim Kardashian are dating now. So there's the gossip for you. Well, Kim Kardashian was at that race. Now, I've been watching Formula One since I was a teenager, before we had Apple podcasts and Apple subscriptions and the way it works now, to the point that I had to wake up early to watch these races. And the thing that I love most about Formula One is hearing the race car drivers, the actual people who are racing. Well, I've noticed that over the past few years, and this is just, it comes with it, it's a big show. They have turned a lot of the publicity over to the celebrities that are attending the race. So rather than talk about the drivers or the engineers or the directors, that are running these teams, now a lot of the interviews prior to the race take place with celebrities. It is what it is. I really don't care that much. But I was surprised to see how much emphasis was placed on Kim Kardashian in that race in Monaco. It's like all the cameras were trained on her, and everybody wanted, like all these interviewers wanted to talk. And I'm thinking to myself, here are the best drivers in the world, nothing against Kim Kardashian, but here are the best drivers in the world at one of the most complicated tracks in the world. And all the attention is on somebody who doesn't even know how to drive any of these cars. So it is what it is. I'm done with my rant, but you get my point. That's a great example of how her status has created this, and not to say that she doesn't have skills or knowledge or things like that, but rather her status is merited through ascription of who she is, right? And it is so strong, and it has such a gravity and such a pull that it took the attention away from all of these incredible drivers from the racetrack itself over to her as a celebrity. So, great example of how ascription is lived out in today's modern world. All right, let's move back to achievement then. Achievement, let's think of it as the medal, right? So you've accomplished a certain number of things, you won the race, or you even participated. Running a marathon, for example, even if you don't win the marathon, is a big deal. So that's when people say, like, if you hear somebody say, oh, I ran a marathon when I was, whatever, or, I learned how to fly a plane, or I've scuba dived. So these are experiences that carry a lot of merit because they're not that common, as opposed to saying, hey, I walked around the block for 10 minutes. Well, everybody can do that, but not everybody can scuba dive, and not everybody can run a marathon. And that's why when you lead through achievement, there's a certain gravity to that as well. One of my favorite things about this type of leadership, by the way, is this idea of let me show you how to do this. So whereas earlier we had this discussion around ascription being do this because I said so, which is, it sounds kind of harsh. I should probably tone that down because it really isn't meant to be a good or a bad thing, right? It's more about effective versus ineffective. So think about that TSA agent. And by the way, I've ran into some wonderful TSA agents that were actually quite comical in their process. And in doing that, they're looking for relatability. But ultimately, a TSA agent is going to tell you to do a certain number of things. A supervisor at work might say, I need you to do X, Y, or Z. So when people do that or say that or act that way, they're leading from ascription, which ultimately leads to compliance. So if compliance is your goal, then this makes perfect sense. And this is why it's important, because people, like I've heard this so many times, will say, like, I want to be more relatable to my team. I want people to come up and talk to me, at the water cooler, hypothetically. I want people to, but they don't approach me ever. I feel like I scare them away or something. Well, you got to look into the mirror. You're very likely leading this way. So you have to learn to lead this way. And by the way, even with skills, you can inadvertently tap into ascription very easily. Let's use that example of that marathon runner, right? So you run a marathon, big deal, it's like a significant accomplishment. But then if you begin to lead based on the accomplishment itself, then you're tiptoeing back to ascription. For example, if you say, oh yeah, I ran a marathon and I ran it in 3 hours and it was the most difficult thing I've ever done. And I was like overtaking people. And then halfway through I got a cramp, but I pushed through. And I don't know many people who've ran a marathon. In fact, have you ran a marathon? Right? So ultimately now you're leading from ascription. You've turned an accomplishment and a skill into status based on who you are. Now you are the guy who ran the marathon. It's no longer, oh, he ran a marathon. That's pretty impressive. You are the guy who ran the marathon. So, I try to add some humor to it, but you get my point, right? Which you're kind of tiptoeing this way, which was this whole Kardashian thing, by the way. It was like, oh, everybody's trained on her because it's who she is. So it's fully ascription. Again, not a bad thing, but it's not quite as inspiring, in my opinion. But I might be a little biased. One example that I absolutely love that's happening right now with the World Cup. I've loved watching the games, and there's this soccer player, a Norwegian soccer player that's like blown up the internet. His name is Holland, and it's like this super tall dude, blonde hair. And prior to the World Cup, I didn't really know much about him, but he seemed to be like a bit of an intimidating soccer player, like had like this stone cold face. And he reminded me, I'm going to age myself here, but back with the Rocky movies, there was one of the boxers that Rocky would fight against. I forget his name, but he was like this blonde machine type looking dude. Anyway, this Holland guy, he kind of gave me that impression of just being like surgically precise, cold. Incredible soccer player. But anyway, it turns out that the guy is a complete goofball, right? And everybody's just loving all that's coming out, all the memes and everything. And, I've watched a couple interviews with him, and I'm quite impressed. The guy just comes off as incredibly easygoing, like somebody you could, grab coffee with or have a beer with, and he would be an incredibly pleasant guy to talk to, right? So what he's doing based on his personality, he is entirely lowering his ascription. So he doesn't want to be known as Holland, the incredible soccer player. He's trying to be as much as he can himself. And in doing that, he's become very relatable. Now contrast that to other figures, and I'm not trying to bash anybody here, but I remember watching the soccer game where Brazil lost, and at the end of the game, Neymar, well, I'm not sure if anybody knows who this guy is, but I think he's retiring after this World Cup. Neymar, who's one of the best soccer players in the world, kicked a penalty at the end of the game. It wasn't enough to overcome their defeat, I guess. But he kept like taunting the goalie, and he kept saying like, I'm number one, I'm number one, I'm number one. And it really rubbed me the wrong way. Like I was thinking to myself, here is a celebrity soccer player who has achieved so much through his skill, his perseverance, his merit. And in the moment when it mattered most, at least from a spectator point of view, and he did score that goal, but I was kind of left thinking like, what a douchebag, like an idiot. So why? Because he turned this into this. He kind of navigated away from this and went over to ascription. So in doing that, and they're all kind of divas in their own way. So I'm not trying to harp on Neymar. I'm sure he's an incredibly, perfectly normal person. Same with like Kim Kardashian. But when they take their skills and their merits and they lead with that, they become king and queen, And when they do that, what is one commonality between kings and queens? They're not relatable, right? They're like over there sitting in a throne somewhere. So the irony is that often those people want to be recognized for their achievement. Like the reason why they're pointing out, I'm number one, is because they kind of want to be remembered that way. They want to be admired. They want to be thought of in a positive light. So it's kind of in a way starts out here like, hey, I did this and it took so much work and so much effort and it was so difficult to accomplish. I want you to see that. So at the root of it is a person wanting you to look their way and acknowledge them, which, that's kind of the big irony. And you could go down a rabbit hole here of humility and self-image and any number of other things. But when people fail to give them that, then they will like pull themselves over here, So it's like in this case, Neymar saying, I didn't win this game. We lost. And in one last ditch effort to become memorable over a game that was probably watched by 40 or 50 million people, he turned it back over to himself and started to lead via ascription, which was a horrible thing. I remember more the goalie. I don't remember his name, but the way he interacted was much more exemplary, I would say, than Neymar himself. And we see this like, anyway, back to my point, this is why Holland is, I think, such a magnetic player, because he not only has skill and merit, but he wants to be relatable. Like there's these images of him putting on like a cowboy hat and cowboy boots with shorts. I mean, the guy looks ridiculous, but it's funny. You know what I mean? So he's become relatable. He doesn't take himself too seriously. He's becoming relatable. Rather than look at me, look at me, look at me, he's like, let me show you how to do this. So it's kind of an attitude of shared meaning and shared purpose. And that's why it becomes so memorable. So I hope this helps. There's one last thing I want to leave you with, which is this quote down here. It says, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about who we pretend to be." So this quote comes from Kurt Vonnegut. He is an American author. I've got his book right here. The book is Mother Night. It's a really good book. I read it a few months ago. But in this book, he talks about a Nazi spy. So this is during World War II. And it was an American officer who became a spy for Nazi Germany. So in other words, he became a Nazi officer as a result of the World War. And he was, sending codes to American troops via his propaganda with, Nazi Germany. So the issue here, though, was, one could argue this. It's a novel, but ultimately there were many people who were spies that, kind of operated on either side of the war. But this individual who had every intention of supporting the American troops and the war, ultimately, I guess I won't spoil it for you, but the constant exposure to Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine, and he was like the head Nazi propaganda guy, ended up like corrupting his soul, because he was exposed to an environment that was so corrosive for such a long time that even though his intentions were good, it ultimately corroded him. So the idea behind be careful who you pretend to be is really when we go into a workplace and we start leading with titles like, I'm the vice president, I'm the number one, I'm, this and that, like Neymar did. And not that I'm trying to compare him with anyone, but when we lead with that and our entire identity is comprised of that, title that we have or that achievement that we accomplished, then we separate ourselves from the rest of the world and we cease to see the dignity in everybody else. And that's a problem. So the best thing you can do there is, a healthy dose of humility. Is Neymar a great player? Yes, but so is Messi, and so is Ronaldo, and so is Haaland. And, there are many great players. And it doesn't take away from their skill or their ability. The same way that you might have ran a marathon, and that's a huge deal. Well, there are many other people who've also ran a marathon, or they have done other accomplishments. Like think of somebody like an astronaut who's landed on the moon. Okay, there's probably very few people who've accomplished that. But there are other people who've done incredible accomplishments nonetheless, right? So all of that has to do with relatability. The more you can lead from achievement and not from ascription, the more relatable you become. But just be careful, because leading with achievement can dip into ascription very quickly if your main goal is to showcase your achievement rather than just live as a result of your achievement. What I can think of today, in today's modern world, Holland, at least now, I don't really know the guy, but he strikes me as really, like towing that line very well, of having incredible achievements while displaying his humanity and his relatability. Back at the turn of the 19th century, it would have been Ernest Shackleton, the British explorer that I mentioned earlier in that book, Endurance. Guys, hope this has helped. We'll definitely catch you on the next one. Take care.